May 3, 1945. Fort Sheridan, Illinois. The fork felt foreign in Klaus Bergmann's calloused hand as he stared down at the plate before him, unable to comprehend what his eyes were telling him. A towering slice of layered chocolate cake, dark and moist, crowned with clouds of whipped cream so white and pristine it seemed to defy the laws of wartime rationing. Beside it sat a crystal glass filled with fresh milk, actual milk that hadn't been watered down or mixed with chalk dust to extend its volume. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. After 4 years of choking down ersatz everything in a crumbling Reich, this had to be some kind of elaborate trap, perhaps even a final humiliation before execution. The other 42 German prisoners sat around him in the mess hall, former Wehrmacht soldiers, Luftwaffe ground crew, and naval personnel who had surrendered during the final desperate weeks as their nation collapsed into rubble and ash. These were not the fanatical SS troops who might choose death over dishonor, but ordinary men who had been drafted into a war machine that promised them glory and delivered only destruction. Men who had truly believed that Germany's technological superiority and martial discipline would overcome any material disadvantage, that willpower and racial purity could defeat the mongrel democracies of the West. What none of them could have predicted was that their entire understanding of reality was about to crumble, not through interrogation or propaganda films, but through the simple act of eating dessert. To grasp the magnitude of what Klaus and his fellow prisoners were experiencing, you need to understand the depths of hunger that had defined their final years in uniform. Klaus had kept a small notebook hidden in his boot throughout his service, scribbling observations when officers weren't watching. His entry from March 1945, written in the ruins of a bombed-out factory outside Dresden, captured the reality that German propaganda tried desperately to conceal. The bread ration dropped again today. Now just 150 grams of that black sawdust mixture they call flour. It tastes like cardboard soaked in machine oil. Private Zimmerman collapsed during morning formation, second man this week. The medic said malnutrition, but we all know it's just a fancy word for starving. We boil grass and tree bark to make soup. The officers tell us sacrifice builds character. I think it just builds graves. Klaus had been a mechanical engineering student at Technical University of Berlin before the war interrupted his studies in 1941. He'd been 20 years old, full of confidence in German ingenuity and the promises of a 1,000-year Reich. By 1945, at 24, he looked closer to 40, his frame gaunt and angular, his eyes hollowed by the kind of hunger that gnaws not just at the stomach but at the soul itself. The Wehrmacht rations that he and millions of other German soldiers received had deteriorated steadily as Allied bombing destroyed supply lines and agricultural production collapsed under the weight of total war. By the final year, the daily allocation for frontline troops consisted of 200 grams of bread bulked up with sawdust and ground peas, a thin soup made from dehydrated vegetables that were often rotten before processing, and occasionally a small portion of horse meat or mystery sausage that soldiers learned not to examine too closely. Coffee had been replaced years ago with roasted acorns and chicory root. Sugar existed only in memories and officers' private stashes. The journey to American captivity had begun during the chaotic collapse of Army Group Center in late April 1945. Klaus had been part of a signals unit attached to a panzer division that no longer had any functioning tanks, just exhausted men retreating westward ahead of the Soviet advance, hoping desperately to surrender to the Americans rather than face Stalin's vengeance. When American forces from the Third Army finally overran their position near the Elbe River, Klaus felt relief rather than shame. The war was over for him, and somehow he had survived when so many had not. The first indication that American captivity would differ from his expectations came during initial processing. American medics, including to his shock several female nurses in uniform, examined each prisoner with a thoroughness that revealed just how badly the German military had neglected its own men. Captain Robert Martinez, the medical officer overseeing intake, documented conditions in his report that read like descriptions of concentration camp survivors rather than combat troops. Average weight deficit of 35 to 40 pounds below normal for height and age. Universal signs of chronic malnutrition including muscle wasting, brittle hair, loose teeth from scurvy, and skin conditions consistent with vitamin deficiencies. Several cases of beriberi causing nerve damage. One man had rickets, a disease we thought was eliminated from modern armies. These prisoners have been systematically starved by their own command structure. The contrast with American plenty began immediately, before Klaus and the others even reached the permanent camp. They received field rations, the famous C rations that American GIs complained about constantly, calling them barely edible. To Klaus, who hadn't tasted real meat in over a year, the small cans of ham and beans seemed like delicacies fit for generals. There were crackers that weren't moldy, cheese that was actually cheese, and small bars of chocolate that he at first refused to believe were real. An American private, noticing Klaus's hesitation, had laughed and said something in English that the interpreter translated. He says this is just emergency food, the stuff they give out when there's nothing better available. He apologizes that you have to eat such poor quality rations. Klaus had stared at that American private for a long moment, trying to process the idea that what seemed like impossible abundance to a starving German soldier was considered substandard by the army that had defeated them. The implications were staggering, but hunger overrode philosophy, and Klaus devoured every item in that C-ration pack, savoring flavors his tongue had almost forgotten existed. The train journey from the temporary processing center to Fort Sheridan provided Klaus and his fellow prisoners their first real glimpse of America, and what they saw challenged every assumption that Nazi propaganda had drilled into them. The train itself was shocking enough, proper passenger cars with padded seats rather than the cattle cars they had expected. Through the windows, they watched an America that was supposed to be on the verge of collapse from racial chaos and democratic weakness. Every town they passed blazed with electric lights even though it was still daylight, a casual waste of energy that would have been criminal in Germany. Every farm had tractors and automobiles, sometimes multiple vehicles, machinery that German farmers could only dream of owning. Every station where the train stopped to refuel revealed ordinary Americans eating food that looked better than anything Klaus had seen in the finest restaurants of Berlin before the war. Children ran around with ice cream cones, laughing and playing without the haunted look that German children had worn for years. Women wore dresses made of real fabric, not the recycled paper and wood fiber that German clothing had been reduced to. Men worked in factories that hummed with productivity, feeding a war machine that apparently could simultaneously crush two major powers while maintaining civilian prosperity. Fort Sheridan had been constructed in the late 1800s but recently expanded to handle the influx of German prisoners. The camp's commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, had served in France during the Great War and understood that these young men were not monsters but products of a monstrous system. His philosophy differed from the harsh treatment some advocated for enemy prisoners. He believed that demonstrating American values through actions rather than words would prove more effective than any punishment in showing these Germans what they had been fighting against. The camp itself exceeded anything Klaus had experienced even as a civilian in peacetime Germany. Electric lighting everywhere, bright enough to read by at any hour. Hot showers with actual water pressure and soap that produced real lather instead of the gritty lye soap they had known. Toilets that flushed, a luxury that had disappeared from most German facilities as infrastructure crumbled. Barracks heated in the lingering spring chill and equipped with real mattresses, not just straw-filled sacks. Each prisoner received clean clothing, not the lice-infested rags they had arrived in, but actual uniforms washed and pressed. Medical care was provided by American military doctors who treated conditions with medicines that Klaus had heard of but never seen, drugs like penicillin that saved lives routinely while German soldiers died from infections that could have been easily cured. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared Klaus Bergmann for his first meal in the main mess hall at Fort Sheridan. As the German prisoners filed through the serving line on that first evening, American kitchen staff served portions that seemed designed to mock their previous deprivation. Roasted chicken, actual chicken with crispy skin and meat that fell from the bone. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter, real butter colored yellow from cream rather than the white margarine substitute mixed with coal tar dyes that Germany had produced. Fresh carrots and green beans, vegetables that weren't pickled or canned or rotted. White bread so soft it compressed under gentle pressure, made from pure wheat flour without adulterants. And coffee, Genuine coffee that smelled like the beverage Klaus remembered from childhood, before the war had replaced it with burnt grain substitutes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Klaus sat at the long table, his plate loaded with more food than he typically saw in 3 days, and felt tears burning in his eyes. Around him, other prisoners reacted with similar emotional intensity. Some ate with desperate speed, as if the food might vanish if they didn't consume it immediately. Others moved slowly, reverently, savoring each bite as if it were a religious sacrament. A few couldn't eat at all, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal from starvation to abundance, their shrunken stomachs rebelling against richness they could no longer process. The psychological impact went beyond simple gratitude for food. These men had been told repeatedly that America was suffering worse than Germany, that democratic chaos had led to economic collapse, that racial mixing had destroyed American productive capacity. Yet here they sat, enemy prisoners, being fed better than German officers, by a nation that was simultaneously fighting wars across 2 oceans and maintaining prosperity at home. The contradiction was so severe it induced a kind of cognitive dissonance that left them dizzy and confused. Klaus forced himself to eat slowly, his engineering mind analyzing the logistics required to feed 500 prisoners 3 substantial meals daily. The organization alone was staggering, coordinating deliveries from multiple suppliers, maintaining cold storage, managing kitchen staff, ensuring variety and nutritional balance. This wasn't the chaotic system that Nazi ideology claimed democracy produced. This was efficiency that exceeded anything the vaunted German military bureaucracy had achieved, even in peacetime. More troubling still was the waste. Klaus watched in disbelief as kitchen staff scraped plates into garbage bins, discarding food that would have been treasured in Germany. Whole slices of bread thrown away because they had touched the floor. Vegetables rejected for minor blemishes. Coffee poured down drains because it had grown lukewarm. The casual disposal of perfectly edible food demonstrated resources so vast that waste meant nothing, abundance so complete that perfection could be demanded and imperfection simply discarded. That first meal broke something inside Klaus, some foundation of belief that had sustained him through 4 years of increasingly desperate warfare. He had endured the Eastern Front's frozen hell, telling himself German discipline would overcome Soviet numbers. He had survived Allied bombing runs, believing German technology would eventually turn the tide. He had accepted starvation rations, trusting that sacrifice would lead to final victory. But sitting in an American mess hall, his stomach full for the first time in memory, Klaus confronted the truth that his entire worldview had been constructed on lies. The Americans weren't weak. They weren't collapsing. They weren't even particularly stressed by the war that had consumed every resource Germany possessed. They were so strong, so wealthy, so organizationally competent that they could feed their enemies better than Germany fed its own soldiers, and do so while crushing the Reich into dust. The days that followed brought more revelations that systematically dismantled everything Klaus thought he knew. The prisoners were assigned work details, not as slave labor but as part of a program to keep them occupied and teach skills useful for post-war reconstruction. Klaus, with his engineering background, was assigned to the camp maintenance shop where he worked alongside American sergeants maintaining generators and electrical systems. The tools alone represented wealth beyond imagination. Every fastener had the correct wrench. Every measurement tool was calibrated and functional. Parts were replaced rather than repaired and re-repaired until they failed catastrophically. The American approach to maintenance assumed abundance, that replacement parts would always be available, that tools needn't be improvised from scrap metal and desperation. Sergeant William Thompson, a machinist from Detroit, supervised Klaus's work detail with casual competence that revealed the depth of American industrial capacity. Thompson had learned his trade in automotive factories that produced vehicles by the thousands, assembly lines that moved with mechanical precision, quality control that caught defects before they became problems. He spoke of factories so large that men rode bicycles between departments, of production numbers that seemed like propaganda exaggerations until Klaus realized they were conservative estimates. A single Ford plant, Thompson explained through broken German and hand gestures, produced more trucks in a month than German industry manufactured in a year. The numbers seemed impossible until Klaus considered the evidence before his eyes. Every vehicle he saw was well maintained, no jury-rigged repairs or cannibalizing parts from one machine to keep another running. Every piece of equipment worked as designed, replaced before failure rather than run until catastrophic breakdown. The American military operated with such surplus that they could afford waste, could discard rather than repair, could maintain standards of quality that German forces had abandoned years ago. The camp library provided another shock to Klaus's understanding of American society. These German prisoners, who had served a regime that burned books and criminalized wrong thought, found themselves with access to thousands of volumes including German literature that had been banned in their homeland. Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Stefan Zweig, authors whose works had been consigned to flames in Berlin's Opernplatz, were available here in an enemy prison camp. Klaus discovered a complete collection of technical manuals, engineering texts, and scientific journals that covered advances German universities hadn't taught because they contradicted Nazi ideology. Physics texts that acknowledged Einstein's contributions rather than dismissing relativity as Jewish science. Medical journals that discussed treatments developed by researchers of all nationalities rather than claiming German genetic superiority produced better doctors. The intellectual freedom represented by that library challenged authoritarian assumptions more effectively than any propaganda film. American magazines and newspapers revealed a society that functioned in ways Nazi ideology claimed were impossible. Life magazine showed suburban homes with multiple automobiles, families eating meals that would have been banquet fare in Germany, children playing with toys that represented more metal and rubber than German industry could spare for civilian use. The Saturday Evening Post ran advertisements for consumer goods that still existed despite total war: refrigerators and washing machines and radios, luxuries that German civilians had sacrificed years ago. The casual assumption that war production could continue alongside civilian manufacturing contradicted everything Klaus had been taught about the necessary trade-offs of total mobilization. More subversive still were the articles about American racial integration in the military. Klaus had been taught that racial mixing destroyed military effectiveness, that mongrel armies lacked the cohesion of pure Germanic units. Yet here was evidence of African American units fighting with distinction, Japanese American soldiers earning medals while their families were interned, Mexican American servicemen like Captain Martinez providing medical care regardless of a patient's background. The diversity that was supposed to be America's fatal weakness appeared instead to be a source of strength. Millions of people from different backgrounds united by shared values rather than divided by enforced racial hierarchies. Klaus spent hours in that library, reading with the intensity of a man trying to reconstruct reality from fragments of truth. Every page challenged another assumption, every article provided evidence that his entire education had been carefully constructed deception. The America he was discovering through books and magazines bore no resemblance to the caricature that Nazi propaganda had created, the weak and decadent nation that should have collapsed under its own contradictions. Instead, he found a society so robust that it could tolerate dissent, so wealthy that it could afford diversity, so confident in its values that it could treat enemies with dignity. The evening meals continued to astound with their abundance and variety. Roast beef one night, pork chops another, fish on Fridays in deference to religious prisoners. Fresh vegetables appeared regularly, shipped from California farms that grew crops year-round in a climate that allowed multiple harvests. Fruits that Klaus hadn't seen since childhood, oranges and apples and bananas, appeared as casual additions to meals rather than rare luxuries. The American diet assumed variety, expected freshness, demanded quality that made German military rations seem like animal fodder by comparison. But the transformation that would define Klaus Bergmann's understanding of American society was still to come. The moment that would shatter his final illusions about democracy and abundance arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the mess hall staff announced something special for dessert. Klaus had no way of knowing that the chocolate cake and whipped cream waiting for him would complete his ideological conversion, that sweetness and cream would succeed where military defeat had failed, proving once and for all that everything he had fought for was built on lies. The anticipation built slowly through that Tuesday afternoon work detail. word had spread among the prisoners that something unusual was planned for the evening meal, special, different from the already abundant daily fare. Klaus worked alongside Sergeant Thompson in the maintenance shop, replacing worn bearings in a generator that powered the camp's refrigeration system, but his mind kept drifting to speculation about what could possibly exceed the plenty they already experienced. Former Luftwaffe mechanic Friedrich Steiner, working at the adjacent bench, voiced what others were thinking. What could be more special than what they already give us? We eat like officers here, better than officers. Maybe it's some kind of test, see how we react to excess. Klaus considered this possibility as he torqued bolts to specification using tools that were neither improvised nor damaged. The generator itself represented casual wealth, replaced rather than repaired into marginal functionality. In the Wehrmacht, this machine would have been kept running through ingenuity and desperation, parts machined by hand, tolerances adjusted to accommodate worn components. Here it was simply swapped out, the old unit sent back to depot for complete rebuild while a fresh generator maintained uninterrupted power. The implications troubled Klaus more than he wanted to admit. American logistics assumed abundance at every level, operated on principles that waste in the present prevented greater waste in the future. German logistics, by contrast, had always been exercises in scarcity management, making do with insufficient resources, stretching supplies beyond reasonable limits. The difference wasn't just material but philosophical, two entirely different approaches to organization and efficiency. As the work detail ended and prisoners filed back to barracks for the pre-dinner washing period, Klaus noticed unusual activity around the mess hall. Additional kitchen staff moved in and out, carrying supplies with focused purpose. The smell that drifted across the compound was unlike anything from previous meals, rich and sweet and utterly foreign to senses trained by years of deprivation. Something was baking, something that required sugar and butter in quantities that seemed almost criminally wasteful by German standards. The shower Klaus took before dinner delivered hot water at pressure that never varied, another small miracle of American infrastructure. Soap that actually cleaned rather than just spreading grime around more evenly. Towels that were freshly laundered rather than stiff with accumulated dirt and sweat. Every small detail of daily existence at Fort Sheridan demonstrated organizational capacity and resource allocation that made pre-war Germany seem impoverished by comparison. As prisoners assembled for the evening meal, Klaus noticed the mess hall had been arranged differently. The usual efficient serving line remained, but additional tables had been set up near the kitchen, draped with white cloth and decorated with fresh flowers, actual flowers in the middle of a military base. The psychological impact of such decoration, such unnecessary beauty, was profound in ways Klaus struggled to articulate. This wasn't just feeding prisoners adequately, this was creating an aesthetic experience, acknowledging that human dignity included more than mere survival. The serving line that evening featured the usual abundance, but Klaus barely noticed the roasted turkey and mashed potatoes, the green beans and fresh rolls. His attention, like that of every prisoner in the hall, was fixed on what waited beyond the main course. Cake, enormous sheet cakes being carefully cut by kitchen staff wearing clean aprons and expressions of concentrated professionalism. Not the dense dark bread cakes that German bakeries produced from limited ingredients, but layer cakes of impossible height, dark chocolate alternating with lighter filling, the whole construction defying gravity and rationing logic simultaneously. Klaus accepted his portion with trembling hands, the plate heavy with a slice that seemed designed for multiple people to share. Beside the cake sat a bowl of whipped cream, actual cream beaten to soft peaks and sweetened with real sugar, more dairy fat in that one serving than Klaus had consumed in the past year. The visual impact was overwhelming, but nothing compared to what happened when he lifted the first forkful to his mouth. The chocolate was genuine, deep and complex, with bitter notes balanced by sweetness that exploded across his tongue. The cake itself was impossibly moist, tender crumb that dissolved without chewing, texture that required butter and eggs in quantities that seemed almost obscene. The filling between layers added vanilla richness that complemented rather than competed with the chocolate intensity. And the whipped cream, sweet clouds of dairy perfection, provided cooling contrast to the cake's density. Klaus closed his eyes involuntarily, overwhelmed by sensations his brain couldn't process after years of bland subsistence. This wasn't just food, it was pleasure for its own sake, enjoyment without justification, sweetness without purpose beyond creating happiness. The concept was fundamentally un-German in ways that went beyond wartime deprivation into something deeper about philosophy and national character. German culture valued discipline, sacrifice, the subordination of individual pleasure to collective purpose. This cake, this extravagant, unnecessary beautiful cake, represented the opposite worldview, the idea that human flourishing included joy, that societies could create surplus specifically for pleasure, that happiness was itself a legitimate goal rather than a suspicious distraction from duty. Around him, other prisoners experienced similar revelations. Friedrich began laughing uncontrollably between bites, a slightly manic sound that spoke to psychological overload rather than simple amusement. Former infantry corporal Hans Weber sat motionless, staring at his half-eaten cake as if it contained answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Several men were crying openly, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization of what had been stolen from their lives by the ideology they had served without questioning. Klaus forced himself to eat slowly, to analyze what he was experiencing with the methodical approach his engineering training had instilled. The cake's ingredients represented more agricultural wealth than a German village saw in months. Real chocolate, which Germany hadn't imported since 1941, when naval blockades and competing war needs ended civilian access to tropical commodities. Sugar in quantities that exceeded monthly rations for entire families. Butter and eggs that would have been luxuries even before the war. Vanilla extract, flour milled from pure wheat, baking powder, milk for both the cake and the whipped cream. The recipe itself was a lesson in American abundance that statistics couldn't convey. Someone, probably Sergeant First Class Dorothy Chen, the head baker whom Klaus had seen earlier, had spent hours creating this dessert not from necessity but from the desire to provide something special to men who were technically enemies. The labor alone represented privilege, time and effort devoted to creating pleasure rather than just sustenance. In Germany, such skills would have been redirected to essential production. Any baker capable of such work would have been making hardtack for troops or ersatz bread for civilians, not decorating cakes for prisoners of war. The temperature of the whipped cream indicated refrigeration technology that most German facilities lacked. This cream had been kept cold through mechanical systems, electricity powering compressors that cycled coolant through insulated spaces, an entire infrastructure devoted to preserving freshness and quality. Klaus had studied thermodynamics at university, understood the engineering required for reliable refrigeration, knew how expensive such systems were to build and operate. Yet here, in a prison camp, such technology was routine enough to preserve cream for dessert. The psychological impact deepened as Klaus realized this wasn't exceptional treatment designed to impress or manipulate. Through conversations with guards during work details, he had learned that American families baked similar cakes for birthdays and holidays, that children expected such desserts regularly, that bakeries in every town produced cakes commercially for customers who bought them on impulse. What the prisoners were experiencing as miraculous abundance was simply Tuesday in America, normal life in a society wealthy enough that luxury was routine. Former naval signalman Otto Hartmann pushed his empty plate away and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. My daughter's birthday was in March. She turned 7. We had no cake, no sugar, no butter, no eggs, nothing to celebrate with except weak tea and the same turnip soup we ate every day. I told her that sacrifices were necessary, that deprivation built character, that German strength came from accepting hardship without complaint. Every word was a lie. Every single word. The silence that followed Otto's statement was profound, 42 men confronting the reality that their sacrifices, their families' suffering, their nation's deprivation, had all been unnecessary. Germany hadn't been strong because of scarcity but weak because of it. The discipline they had taken pride in was just organized starvation. The character their hardship supposedly built was actually trauma that would mark them for life. Meanwhile, America had prospered, had grown stronger, had defeated Germany while maintaining civilian abundance that included chocolate cake for prisoners. Klaus scraped the last traces of whipped cream from his plate, the sweetness lingering on his tongue like evidence in a trial where everything he had believed stood accused. The cake had been good, better than good, transcendently delicious in ways that went beyond flavor into something approaching revelation. But the real taste it left wasn't chocolate or vanilla or sweet cream. It was the bitter flavor of understanding that his entire life had been shaped by lies, that the ideology he had accepted without question had stolen not just victory but basic human pleasure from millions of people who deserved better. The transformation was complete, or so Klaus thought in that moment. The brownies and chocolate milk might have been the opening salvo, but this cake, this impossible wonderful terrible cake, had finished the work of demolishing his Nazi worldview. He had tasted democracy and it was delicious, more delicious than propaganda had any right to be, so delicious that he couldn't imagine ever believing German superiority again. But he was wrong about the transformation being complete. Tomorrow would bring revelations that went even deeper, experiences that would show him that abundance and dessert were just the surface of what American society could achieve. The real shock, the true demolition of Nazi ideology, was still to come. And it would arrive not through food but through freedom, not through plenty but through dignity, not through what America gave its prisoners but through what America allowed them to become. The morning after the chocolate cake arrived with a shift that Klaus hadn't anticipated. Colonel Patterson announced that prisoners could volunteer for educational programs, actual university-level courses taught by American instructors who would treat them as students rather than enemies. Klaus signed up immediately for advanced mathematics and electrical engineering, subjects his interrupted studies had left incomplete. The classroom itself challenged expectations built by years of military rigidity. Desks arranged in semicircles rather than rigid rows. An instructor, Professor Malcolm Wright from Northwestern University, who encouraged questions instead of demanding silent obedience. Textbooks printed on quality paper with clear diagrams, not the increasingly crude wartime publications Germany had produced as resources dwindled. Professor Wright's first lecture demolished Klaus's remaining illusions about German technical superiority. The Americans had developed radar systems far beyond what German engineers achieved. Proximity fuses that German scientists hadn't conceived possible. Computing machines that performed calculations faster than human mathematicians. Each revelation hammered home the reality that Germany hadn't lost because of betrayal or bad luck but because American innovation had simply outpaced German capabilities across every technological front. During a break, Klaus gathered courage to ask the question haunting him. Why teach us this? Why give education to men who fought against you? Professor Wright's answer was simple but profound. Because knowledge isn't proprietary to nations. Because educated men rebuild better societies than ignorant ones. Because we believe human potential shouldn't be wasted, even in former enemies. The concept was revolutionary to Klaus, raised in a system where knowledge was controlled, where universities expelled students for wrong ethnicity or wrong ideology, where education served the state rather than the individual. Here was an enemy offering him tools to rebuild his mind and his future without demanding political conversion or ideological confession. The gift came with no strings attached except the expectation that he would use it constructively. Afternoons brought another form of education that proved equally transformative. The camp library received newspapers daily, and prisoners were allowed to read accounts of ongoing events including Germany's total collapse. Klaus learned through American journalism what German propaganda had hidden, the full extent of concentration camps, the systematic murder of millions, the bureaucratic machinery of genocide that had operated while ordinary Germans claimed ignorance. The reading made Klaus physically ill. He had known the Reich treated Jews harshly, had heard rumors of deportations and harsh conditions, but the documented reality of industrial-scale extermination exceeded anything his conscience had prepared for. Photographs didn't lie. Witness testimonies from liberating soldiers couldn't be dismissed as enemy propaganda when they came with such overwhelming evidence. Klaus confronted the horrible truth that the nation he had served, the cause he had accepted, had been fundamentally evil in ways that no military defeat could adequately punish. Former Corporal Hans Weber found Klaus in the library that evening, staring at photographs from Buchenwald with tears streaming down his face. Hans sat down heavily beside him and spoke words that captured what they were all feeling. We told ourselves we were just soldiers following orders. But those orders came from somewhere. That system existed because people like us let it exist. We can't undo what was done, but we can refuse to ever be that blind again. The conversation that night in the barracks went deep into questions none of them had dared ask during their service. How had they not known? How had they not questioned? How had ordinary men enabled such extraordinary evil? The answers were uncomfortable but necessary. They hadn't known because they hadn't wanted to know. They hadn't questioned because questioning was dangerous. They had enabled evil through the small act of going along, of accepting what they were told, of prioritizing personal survival over moral courage. The chocolate cake took on new meaning in light of these revelations. It wasn't just about American abundance versus German scarcity. It was about societies that valued human dignity versus systems that industrialized human destruction. The whipped cream and chocolate layers represented more than prosperity. They symbolized a worldview where people mattered as individuals, where pleasure had value, where even enemies deserved to be treated as human beings capable of redemption rather than as objects to be used and discarded. Klaus volunteered for every work detail, every educational program, every opportunity to learn what America was and what Germany might become. He studied in the library until lights out, reading everything from political philosophy to agricultural science, rebuilding his understanding of how societies could function. He practiced English with patient guards who corrected his grammar without mocking his accent. He attended lectures on democracy and constitutional government given by visiting professors who treated German prisoners as worthy of intellectual respect. The transformation wasn't just individual but collective. The prisoners began organizing themselves democratically, electing representatives to coordinate with camp administration, resolving disputes through discussion rather than hierarchy, practicing the principles they were learning about. Former officers found themselves without automatic authority. Former enlisted men discovered voices they hadn't known they possessed. The American system was teaching through example rather than lecture, showing that democracy wasn't chaos but a different kind of order, one that required more from citizens but offered more to humanity. By summer, Klaus barely recognized himself in the mirror. He had gained weight, yes, but more than that, he had gained something harder to measure. Hope, perhaps, or dignity, or the simple understanding that his life could have meaning beyond serving systems that demanded subordination. The chocolate cake had been a catalyst, but the real transformation came from discovering that societies could be built on principles other than domination and fear. As weeks turned to months, prisoners began preparing for eventual repatriation to a Germany that no longer existed, not physically but ideologically. They would return not as defeated soldiers but as witnesses to an alternative way of organizing human life. They would rebuild their nation not according to fantasies of racial purity and authoritarian efficiency but according to principles they had learned through the strange generosity of former enemies who had fed them cake and taught them mathematics and treated them as human beings worthy of redemption. Klaus Bergmann would eventually return to Berlin in 1946, completing his engineering degree and spending his career rebuilding infrastructure in a democratic West Germany. But he never forgot the taste of that chocolate cake, the sweetness that had begun his journey from true believer to questioning citizen. He would tell his children and grandchildren about it, not as a story about dessert but as a lesson about the power of abundance to challenge scarcity thinking, the capacity of generosity to overcome hatred, and the simple truth that societies revealing their values not through propaganda but through how they treat their enemies when they have every excuse to be cruel. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.